The parking lot of Sunnyside Diner had never held more than 14 cars on its best Saturday morning. It was a small lot on a two-lane road in coastal Jacksonville, Florida. Cracked asphalt, a faded painted line marking the handicap space. A rusted pole with a sign had been re-bolted twice since the storm of 2019. On a Tuesday morning in October held 3 regulars' vehicles, a delivery truck idling near the side entrance and nothing else. Until the sound. It came before the vehicles were visible, a low, coordinated rumble of multiple engines moving together with a kind of unhurried certainty that does not belong to a diner parking lot in a small Florida town. The kind of sound that makes people look up from their coffee, without knowing why. Inside Sunnyside Diner, every head turned toward the window at the same moment. 10 black SUVs turned off the road and into the lot in a single fluid line. Government plates on 4 of them. The rest carrying particular anonymity of private security vehicles assembled by people who do not leave details to chance. They pulled in and stopped with the coordinated precision of a motorcade. Before the engines had fully cut, doors were opening and suited figures were stepping out and taking positions. Not urgently, not dramatically, just with the calm professional efficiency of people doing exactly what they were trained to do exactly when they were trained to do it. The diner went completely still. Gerald Potts stood behind the counter with both hands pressed flat against the surface, and his face doing a series of things he could not fully control. Miss Dottie set down her newspaper. Earl stopped mid-shuffle with his dominoes. Big Ray appeared in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in his hand and stayed there. On the sidewalk outside the diner door, a black American woman stood alone. She was still wearing her uniform. Her apron was folded in a neat square in her hands. Her bag was on her shoulder. Her chin was level. She had pushed through that door 30 seconds ago for what she had just been told was the last time, and she had walked out with the upright, self-contained dignity of a woman who had decided a long time ago that no room and no person and no amount of humiliation had the right to make her small. She heard the engines. She turned around. The door of the center SUV opened. One man stepped out. He did not wait for security. He did not look around. He walked across the parking lot alone, directly toward her, with the focused, purposeful stride of a man for whom this moment was the entire reason he had driven to Jacksonville that morning. She knew that face. She had not seen it in 10 weeks. She had last seen it at a corner table in the diner she had just been fired from, ordering black coffee and the cheapest thing on the menu and leaving a decent tip in cash. He stopped in front of her on the sidewalk. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. 10 weeks ago, this woman did not know who he was. She helped him anyway. This is that story. Go back to the beginning. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Echo True Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, share with your friends, and most importantly, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story when I drop one. Drop your thoughts and reactions in the comments. If a complete stranger had been quietly helping you through the hardest weeks of your life without knowing who you were, and you had the power to change everything for them, what would you do? Let's dive in. 10 weeks earlier, Sunnyside Diner smelled the way it always smelled on Monday morning. Coffee that had been running since 5:30, butter on the flat top, something sweet from the pie case that Big Ray restocked before the first customer came through the door. The light came through the east-facing windows in long flat angles and landed warm on the vinyl booth seats and the laminate tabletops and the worn linoleum floor that Camille Rivers had mopped herself every morning for 4 years. She was good at this job, not in the way that people are good at things they have settled for, in the way that people are good at things they have decided to do with full attention, because full attention is the only way she knew how to do anything. She knew every regular by name and by order. She knew who took their coffee with 2 sugars and who was cutting back on sugar and who pretended to be cutting back and still wanted to. She knew which booths got the afternoon sun and which ones didn't, and she seated people accordingly without making a production of it. She was quick and she was accurate, and she had a way of making people feel like they were the most attended-to person in the room, even when the room was full. She was also, as of 7 months ago, managing the morning shift alone, because Gerald had cut the second waitress position to save $40 a week on labor. He had not reduced her workload. He had not increased her pay. He had simply redistributed the work onto her with the confidence of a man who had correctly calculated that she would not quit because she could not afford to. Camille Rivers was 32 years old. She had grown up in Jacksonville, the second of 4 children, and had come back to it after 2 years in Tallahassee, pursuing a hospitality management degree she had not been able to finish after her mother got sick. She had Marcus, who was 9 years old and small for his age and had his father's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness and a talent for mathematics that his teacher described as genuinely exceptional in a note that Camille had folded and put in a small wooden box she kept on her dresser for things worth keeping. Marcus's father had not been in the picture since Marcus was 3. This was not a wound Camille carried openly. It was simply a fact she had absorbed and organized her life around the way you organize your life around any fixed condition, with practicality and without sentimentality, and with a specific determination that her son would not grow up measuring himself against an absence. She paid her rent on time every month. She kept the lights on. She kept food in the house. She was 3 months behind on a hospital bill from an emergency room visit in April that she had not been able to prevent and had not yet been able to fully address, and the collections calls had started, and she dealt with them with the same upright pragmatism she brought to everything. She answered. She explained her situation plainly. She made whatever partial payment she could manage, and she kept moving. Gerald Potts had owned Sunnyside Diner for 19 years. He was 64 years old, heavy-set, with a gray mustache and small, careful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the permanent expression of a man counting something in his head. He ran the diner with the efficiency of someone for whom efficiency was a form of control. The menu had not changed in 11 years. The prices had changed once, upward, in 2021. The staff had turned over completely 3 times in 4 years, with the exception of Camille and Big Ray, who had both stayed because leaving would have required more disruption than staying, and because they had both, separately, made their peace with the particular compromises involved. Gerald had never said out loud what he thought about certain customers. He had not needed to. It was present in the way he watched certain tables, in the way he moved through the dining room when certain people came in the new sign he had put in the window 6 months ago. Management reserves the right to refuse service, which was technically a standard notice, and contextually something else entirely. Camille had been feeding the community around the diner for as long as she had worked there, not dramatically, not as a program or a policy or a statement, simply as a thing she did when a person came in with not quite enough, $1 short, a handful of change, sometimes an apology and empty pockets, because that was who she was, and because the food that went uncollected would be going in the trash anyway, and she could not reconcile throwing food away when she could see a hungry person from where she was standing. Gerald Doctor paid for it. A few dollars here, a few there. He kept a running tally that he presented to her monthly with the neutral language of a man describing a policy rather than expressing a bias. Camille accepted the deductions without argument. She adjusted her own budget. She kept going. She had been keeping going for 4 years. On a Monday morning in September, a man she had never seen before sat down at the corner table. He was white, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a lean, angular face and pale gray eyes that were sharp underneath the exhaustion sitting in them. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and jeans that were clean, but did not fit him quite right. Not badly, just with a slight imprecision of clothes chosen quickly by someone who did not usually choose his own clothes. His shoes were the kind you could buy at any chain store for $40. He sat down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had been on his feet for a long time and was grateful for the chair. He looked at the menu for a moment. Then he ordered black coffee and the day's special, which was the cheapest full plate on the menu at $6.50. He paid in cash. He left $2 on the table. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Camille noticed in the way she noticed everything, without making production of the noticing. She noticed that he always took the corner table, which gave him a clear sight line to the door. She noticed that he always paid in cash and always in exact amounts, as if he had counted out beforehand. She noticed that he flinched, just slightly, just for a half second, every time the diner door opened. She noticed that he was careful with the food in the way that people are careful with food when they are not sure where the next plate is coming from. She kept his coffee full. She held the corner table even on the mornings when other customers came in first and wanted it. She brought him the extra biscuit from a morning batch when there was one going spare, setting it on the side of his plate without comment, the way she did for the regulars. His name, he told her when she asked on the third morning, was John. "Just John," he said. She said, "All right, John, you want the usual?" He said yes. And something in the set of his shoulders loosened very slightly. The way a person loosens when they have been treated like an ordinary human being in a situation where they were not certain that was going to happen. She went to get his coffee and did not make anything more of it than that. What Camille did not know, what she had no way of knowing and no reason to suspect, was that the man sitting in her corner table was not John. He was Warren Holt. His full name was Warren James Holt. He was 53 years old. He had been born in Atlanta, Georgia, the only child of a man who had built a regional construction and real estate company from scratch, and a mother who had taught Warren, from the time he could understand language, that the world had an order to it, and that their family occupied a specific and elevated position within that order. He had absorbed this belief the way children absorb the beliefs of their environment, completely uncritically, and so thoroughly that by the time he was old enough to question it, it had become invisible to him, not a belief, just the shape of things. He had taken over Holt Enterprises at 31 and expanded it aggressively across 12 years into one of the largest private real estate and development portfolios in the southeastern United States. He was, by any objective measure, one of the 10 wealthiest private citizens in the country. He had a home in Atlanta, a property in the Florida Keys, an apartment in New York, and a ranch in Montana that he visited twice a year. He had also, for days before he walked into Sunnyside Diner, received an anonymous encrypted message that told him in plain, urgent language that his wife Elena and his business partner David Rice had been under federal investigation for 18 months and that the arrests were 72 hours away, and that if he wanted to survive what was coming, he needed to disappear before Elena and David knew he was gone. The charges, when they came, were conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and attempted murder. The attempted murder target was Warren. Elena and David had been systematically stripping assets from Holt Enterprises for 2 years, redirecting funds through a series of shell companies, and had contracted someone to ensure Warren did not survive long enough to discover the extent of what they had done. Warren had left Atlanta with a prepaid phone, $4,500 in cash, and the clothes on his back. He had driven to Jacksonville because it was far enough from Atlanta and anonymous enough to disappear into without a plan. His federal contact, a prosecutor named Shields, who had been the source of the anonymous tip, had told him clearly, "Stay invisible, stay low, do not access any accounts or cards, trust no one, and wait for the call that the case was complete and it was safe to surface." He had found the room above the bait shop on his second day. He had found the diner on his third. He had sat down at the corner table and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu because $4,500 had to last an unknown number of weeks, and he had no way of knowing how long invisible was going to need to be. He had also, sitting in that corner booth for the first time in his adult life with nothing in his pocket and no one he could call, become aware of something that his entire life up until that point had been arranged to prevent him from noticing. He was dependent on the kindness of strangers. And the strangers in this particular place were not the kind of people he had spent 53 years considering capable of the kind of grace that circumstance was now requiring him to receive. He sat with that awareness and said nothing about it and tried to figure out what to do with it. He did not yet know that figuring out what to do with it was going to become the most important work of his life. The second week, Warren learned the regulars, not intentionally, not as a project, simply because the corner table at Sunnyside Diner was his fixed point in a life that had been stripped of every other fixed point, and the people who moved through that space were the only human contact he had. And after enough mornings in the same chair, a person begins to absorb the texture of a place whether they intend to or not. Miss Dottie arrived every morning at 7:15, which was 15 minutes after Warren, and she always brought her own newspaper because Gerald charged 25 cents for the copies by the door, and Miss Dottie had been supplementing her Social Security for 11 years and knew exactly which 25 cents were worth spending. She was 74 years old, deep dark brown skin, white hair cut close to her head, and she sat in the second booth in the window and read every section of the paper in order, news first, then local, then sports, then crossword, and greeted everyone who came to the door by name, including Warren by the end of his first week, because Camille had introduced them and Miss Dottie considered an introduction binding. She started saving him the sports section on the mornings she finished it before he arrived. She said at the end of his table, without comment. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't mention it." This happened every morning for 6 weeks, without either of them making anything more of it. Earl came in at 8 after the fishing boats returned. He was 67, retired from the commercial fishing fleet, with the wide weather hands and the careful, unhurried movement of a man who had spent 40 years doing physical work that required patience above all other things. He played dominoes. He had a travel set in a leather pouch that he kept in his jacket pocket, and he played against himself on slow mornings in the way that people who genuinely love a game play it, not to win but to think. On the 3rd week, he set the pouch on Warren's table and asked if he knew how to play. Warren did not. Earl taught him over 2 mornings. By the end of the 2nd morning, Warren was losing badly and finding, to his considerable surprise, that he did not mind. Big Ray ran the kitchen. He was 41 years old, built like a man who had been cooking since before he was tall enough to see over the counter, which was approximately true. He did not talk much during the rush, but on slow mornings he leaned in the kitchen doorway and had opinions about everything: the weather, the fishing, the local politics, the right way to make a proper biscuit, which was apparently a subject with definitive answers that most people were getting wrong. By the end of Warren's 2nd week, his eggs arrived at the corner table exactly as he liked them. Yolks intact, whites fully set, a piece of toast cut diagonally, because he had mentioned once, without thinking, that he preferred it that way. Big Ray had not asked him to confirm this preference. He had simply remembered it and acted on it, which was a kind of attention that Warren had paid people to give him his entire adult life, and had never particularly noticed until a cook in a diner in Jacksonville did it for $3 a plate. And there was Camille. She moved through the diner with the specific efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that competence had become invisible. She was simply present and accurate and responsive in a way that made the whole operation feel effortless from the outside. She remembered everything, not just orders. She remembered that the man in booth 4 was having a difficult week because his sister was in the hospital in Tampa, and she asked about it when he came in on Thursday. She remembered that the elderly woman who came in on Tuesdays had a hard time reading the small print on the menu, and she recited the specials rather than pointing to them. She remembered, without Warren having told her explicitly, that he did not like to be approached when he was watching the door, and she had developed a way of refilling his coffee that did not require him to acknowledge her presence if he was in the middle of being watchful. He noticed all of it. He noticed it with a part of him that had spent 12 years running a company and understood that the quality of someone's work is a direct expression of the quality of their character, that you cannot sustain that level of attentiveness unless the attentiveness comes from somewhere real. He also noticed what she was doing for the community around the diner. He saw it for the first time on a Wednesday in his 2nd week. An elderly man came in, thin, moving slowly, counting coins at the counter before he sat down. He counted them twice. He looked at the menu. He ordered the coffee, which was $1.50, and nothing else. Camille brought the coffee and a plate of biscuits and gravy that he had not ordered. When the man started to protest, she said Big Ray had made too many, and they were going to waste, and she set it down and moved on before he could argue. Warren watched the man eat those biscuits. He watched him eat them with the particular focused attention of a man who had not had a full meal that day and possibly not the day before, and something moved through Warren that he did not have an immediate name for. Not pity. Pity requires distance. This was something closer and more uncomfortable than pity. He saw it again the following Monday. A woman came in with 2 small children, ordered 1 plate, and asked for 2 extra forks. Camille brought the plate and 2 smaller plates on the side and divided the food without being asked, adding portions from the kitchen that doubled what the woman had paid for. She put the check face down on the table, and when the woman looked at it, she looked up at Camille, and Camille was already across the room and not available for conversation. He watched Gerald watch this from behind the office window. He watched Gerald write something in a small notebook he kept beside the register. At the end of that week, Camille's paycheck was $12 short. Warren knew because he had been in the corner, and he saw her look at it, and he saw her jaw tighten for exactly 1 second before she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to work. He thought about the framework he had built his entire life on, the assumptions he carried into every room without examining them, the way he had always sorted people into categories of worth so automatically that the sorting had become invisible to him. Not a decision, just a fact. He thought about what those categories had been built on. What evidence, what actual evidence, examined honestly, they had ever been based on. He was not comfortable with the answer. He stayed in the corner and said nothing and watched and tried to understand what was happening to things he had always believed, and why the understanding felt less like loss and more like something being returned to him that he had not known was missing. On the fourth week, Gerald put a new sign in the window, bold black letters on white card. Management reserves the right to refuse service. It was a standard notice. Warren had seen it in establishments his whole life and had never once thought about who it was pointed at. He thought about it now. He looked at Camille, reading it when she arrived that morning. He watched her face for a reaction. She read it. She turned away. She started the coffee. That was all. But Warren sat with what it meant that a woman who gave this much to this place every single day could read that sign and simply turn away and start the coffee. Not because she did not understand it, but because she had decided a long time ago that the sign was not going to be the thing that stopped her. He thought about that for a long time. He was still thinking about it 2 weeks later, when he ran out of money. Do not go anywhere. Subscribe to Echo Truth Stories, because the moment that changes everything in this story is coming, and you are not going to want to miss it. He missed Monday and Tuesday. He had $42 left, and the rent on the room above the bait shop was due Friday, and he had not heard from Shields, and the case was taking longer than anyone had told him it would, and he sat in the small room with its single window, looking out over the marina, and did the arithmetic over and over, and arrived at the same answer every time. He could not afford the diner. It was a fact so small it should have been insignificant. He had written checks larger than the GDP of small nations. He had signed off on acquisition deals that rearranged entire city blocks. He had once, at charity auction in Atlanta, paid $70,000 for a bottle of wine he had not particularly wanted because the bidding had become a matter of principle. He could not afford $6.50 for a plate of eggs and a biscuit. He sat in that room and felt the full specific weight of that for the first time, the weight of having nothing, the way it narrows the world down to the immediate and the concrete and removes all the buffer between a person and the raw facts of their situation. He had known intellectually that people live this way. He had processed it as a category of human experience that existed at a comfortable theoretical distance from his own. He was no longer processing it theoretically. On Wednesday morning, he heard a knock at the door of the bait shop. He came down the stairs slowly, alert in the way he had been alert for 6 weeks. Scanning, assessing, calculating threat before he opened anything. He opened the door. Camille Rivers was standing on the step outside with a brown paper bag in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. She was in her uniform, which meant she had come before her shift or during a break. She held the bag out. 2 biscuits, she said. Some soup. Coffee. She paused. You hadn't been in for 2 days. Figured you might need it. She set the bag and the coffee on the counter just inside the door. She did not ask to come in. She did not wait for a response. She turned around and walked back toward the street with the brisk, purposeful movement of a woman who had somewhere to be and had done what she came to do and did not require acknowledgement for doing it. He stood in the doorway and watched her go. He went back inside and sat down on the single chair in the bait shop and held the paper bag in his lap and did not open it for several minutes. He had been surrounded by wealth his entire life. He had been surrounded by people whose entire professional purpose was to anticipate his needs and address them before he had to articulate them. He had assistants, house staff, a personal chef, a security team, a driver. He had people whose job it was to ensure that his coffee was the right temperature and his schedule was optimally arranged and his preferences were remembered and honored in every context. Not one of them, not a single one of the dozens of well-compensated professionals whose livelihoods depended on attending to his comfort, had ever done for him what this woman had just done, because what she had done had nothing to do with compensation. It had nothing to do with expectation or obligation or professional responsibility or social calculation. She had done it because she was the kind of person who notices when someone has not been in for 2 days and responds to that noticing with action rather than indifference, and because that was simply who she was, full stop, without qualification, without any of the conditions that Warren had spent 53 years applying to his assessment of who certain people were and what they were capable of. He opened the bag. He ate the biscuits and the soup and drank the coffee. He did it slowly because he wanted to, Because for the first time in 6 weeks, something warm had arrived without agenda, and he wanted to sit inside it for a few minutes before it was gone. Something in him broke open that morning. Not dramatically, not with the clean narrative shape of a conversion. Quietly, the way ice breaks in late February. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small fractures that have been forming for weeks until the surface can no longer hold its original shape and simply releases. He thought about the categories he had always sorted people into. He thought about the evidence, the actual evidence, examined without the filter of a lifetime of unquestioned assumption that those categories had ever been based on anything real. He thought about Miss Dottie and her newspaper, Earl and his dominoes, Big Ray remembering how he liked his eggs. He thought about Camille at the register, watching a family count coins and responding with plates on the side and a check placed face down and her back already turned. He thought about Gerald's notebook and the $12 short and the sign in the window. He thought about what it meant that the most genuine human kindness he had encountered in 53 years of living had arrived in a small diner in coastal Florida from people he had spent his entire life discounting. He was ashamed, not performatively, not in a way that produces apologies and gestures and public positioning. In the deep, private, specific way that happens when a person stops lying to themselves about something important and sees clearly, for the first time, the full dimensions of the lie. He sat with that shame for a long time. He did not try to resolve it quickly. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some things are not supposed to resolve quickly. Some things are supposed to sit with you and work on you until they have finished what they came to do. He also, in the days that followed, found himself paying attention to Camille's situation in a way he had not before. He was back at the corner table by Thursday. Shields had wired him emergency funds through a secure channel, untraceable, enough to last another few weeks. And from that corner table he watched the pressure on Camille escalate in ways he recognized from a lifetime of watching powerful people apply pressure to people with less power. Gerald's deductions were getting larger. The amounts were not accidental. They were calibrated to sting without being large enough to constitute a legal violation. The sign in the window had been moved closer to the door. Gerald had begun, on the mornings when the community regulars came in, walking the floor in a way that was not quite harassment and was not quite hospitality. Just a presence that said you are being watched and you are not fully welcome here, and I want you to feel that without my having to say it. Camille did not change. She still covered the difference. She still brought the extra biscuit. She still placed checks face down and turned away before anyone could argue. She was losing money every week doing it, and she did not stop, because stopping was not a thing she was built for. Warren watched all of this and said nothing. He was still John. He was still waiting for the call. But the man who had walked into this diner 6 weeks ago was not the same man sitting in the corner now, and the distance between those two versions of himself was measured entirely in small moments of ordinary human decency that had been offered him freely by people he had never deserved them from. He was going to have to find a way to be accountable to that. He just did not know yet exactly how. The call came on a Thursday evening. Shields, for word before the details. It is over, surface. Elena and David were formally charged and in custody. The case was airtight. It was safe. Warren could come back. He sat in the room above the bait shop and looked at the wall for a long time after he hung up. He thought about what surfacing meant, about the world he was going back to, the interviews, the legal proceedings, the board meetings, the asset recovery, the long, complicated process of rebuilding what had been systematically dismantled by two people he had trusted completely. All of that was waiting for him. All of that was real and necessary, and would begin the moment he made himself visible again. But first there was something he needed to do. He went to the diner the next morning. Friday, Camille's double shift. He planned to sit down at the corner table and tell her the truth, who he was, why he had come, what the past 10 weeks had been. He had thought carefully about how to say it. He wanted to be plain, and he wanted to be honest, and he did not want the telling to be about what he needed from her. He did not need anything from her. He simply owed her the truth, and he was going to give it. He turned into the Sunny Side Diner parking lot at 7:45, and through the plate glass window, he could see immediately that something was wrong. The morning regulars were all in their places. Miss Dottie, Earl, Big Ray visible in the kitchen doorway, but none of them were moving. The diner had the specific frozen quality of space in which something is happening that nobody knows how to respond to. Camille was standing in front of the counter in her apron with her order pad on the surface between her and Gerald. Gerald was speaking. Camille was listening with her chin level and her hands completely still at her sides. Warren stayed outside. He stood in the parking lot and watched through the window and understood within 30 seconds what he was watching. Gerald was firing her. He could not hear the words, but he did not need to. He could read Gerald's posture, the forward lean, the pointed finger, the particular energy of a man who has been building towards something for a long time and has finally given himself permission to say it. He could read the faces of the regulars, Miss Dottie with her eyes on the table, Earl motionless with his dominoes in his hand, Big Ray in the kitchen doorway with his jaw tight and his hands very still. He watched Camille listen. He watched her face, the slight tension at the jaw, the eyes steady and unblinking, taking in everything Gerald was saying without giving him anything back. Not defensiveness, not argument, just presence. The specific presence of a woman who has decided that whatever is being done to her does not have the right to change who she is while it is being done. When Gerald finished, she reached up and removed her apron. She folded it with 2 clean, deliberate movements into a neat square. She set it on the counter. She picked up her bag from behind the register. She walked through the dining room without looking at Gerald or the regulars or at the window where Warren was standing. She walked the way she always walked. Upright, unhurried, contained, as if the floor beneath her was exactly as solid as it had always been and always would be. She pushed through the door. She stepped out into the Jacksonville morning with her apron in her hands and her bag on her shoulder and her chin level, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the door of the diner that had just fired her, and she took one long, steady breath. Warren was already moving. He had taken 3 steps toward her when he heard the engines. He stopped. The sound came from the road, multiple vehicles, heavy, coordinated, unmistakable. He turned. The first black SUV turned off the road into the diner parking lot, and the second followed in the third, and he counted them as they came because his legal team had called that morning to confirm the motorcade, and he had told them 10 vehicles, and there were 10 vehicles pulling into the lot of Sunnyside Diner in coastal Jacksonville, Florida, on a Friday morning in October. The SUV doors opened. His security team stepped out with the calm efficiency he had insisted on when he had assembled them 15 years ago. Visible but not theatrical, present but not aggressive. They took positions around the lot perimeter. Then they waited. Warren crossed the parking lot. Camille had not moved from the sidewalk. She was watching the SUVs with the particular expression of a person trying to understand something that does not fit into any available category. When Warren stopped in front of her, she looked at his face, and the expression changed. Recognition arriving slowly. The way recognition arrives when the context is so wrong that the mind resists the conclusion it is reaching. He said, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you everything." Inside the diner, Gerald Potts stood behind his counter with both hands flat on the surface and watched a motorcade of 10 black SUVs arrange themselves in his parking lot and felt, for the first time in 19 years of ownership, that his kingdom was not quite as secure as he had always assumed. He was correct. Warren told Camille everything. He told her standing in the parking lot with the morning sun coming at an angle off the SUV windshields and the sound of the marina 2 blocks over, and the diner window full of the faces of people who had become, without his planning for it, the fixed points of 10 of the most disorienting weeks of his life. He told her his name. He told her about Elena and David and the 18 months of investigation, and the night he had disappeared, and why he had come to Jacksonville, and what staying invisible had required. He told her about the corner table and the cash and the costume that had not fit quite right and the coffee she had kept full without asking anything in return. And then he told her the rest of it. He told her about the framework he had carried his whole life, the assumptions, the hierarchies, the quiet, unexamined certainty that he had never once subjected to honest scrutiny because he had never been in a situation that required him to. He said it plainly and without softening it because she was owed the plain version, and because anything less than plain would be another form of the dishonesty he was trying to be done with. He told her what 10 weeks in that corner booth had done to that framework. Not dramatically, not as a conversion story with a clean arc and a satisfying conclusion, as the truth, which was that something had been eroding for weeks, one small, unremarkable moment at a time, and the brown paper bag on a Tuesday morning had been the moment the surface gave way, and he had understood, with a clarity he could not argue with, that he had been wrong about something fundamental for his entire adult life. Camille listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She looked at him with the wide, watchful dark eyes that had been reading people accurately across diner tables for 4 years, and she took the full measure of what she was looking at. Then she said, "I knew something was off about you from the first morning." He said, "I know." She said, "I helped you anyway, not because of who you were, because of who I am. That is the only reason it ever happens for me. That is always the only reason." He said, "I understand that now. I did not understand it 10 weeks ago. I understand it now." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "So what happens now?" He said, "I have some things I want to ask you, not as payment, not as a transaction, as a man who was changed by someone and wants to be accountable to that change in a way that is actually useful." He paused. "But first I need to go have a conversation with the man inside that diner." He walked to the diner door. He pushed it open. He walked across the floor of Sunnyside Diner for the first time in his own name, and his own clothes, and his own identity, and he sat down on a corner table, and he looked at Gerald Potts behind the counter, and he told Gerald that he wanted to buy the diner. Not later. That morning. Gerald said it was not for sale. Warren told him his legal team would have a fair market offer on the table before noon, and that Gerald should take it because the alternative was a detailed review of his labor practices and deduction records by a team of employment lawyers that Warren was also prepared to commission that morning if the conversation went in a different direction. Gerald took the offer. He was out by end of business. The paperwork was completed in a conference room at a Jacksonville law office on a Friday afternoon. Warren's legal team had driven up from Atlanta that morning. The offer was fair, above fair, actually, because Warren was not interested in taking something from someone, even someone who had earned taking from. He wanted it clean. He wanted it done correctly, and he wanted it done that day. Gerald Potts signed the transfer documents at 2:15 in the afternoon with the expression of a man who had walked into a situation he did not fully understand and had emerged from it having received fair value for his asset and a comprehensive understanding of exactly how small his kingdom had always actually been. He left without speaking to Camille or to anyone else from the diner. The new operating agreement for Sunnyside Diner was drafted that same afternoon. It was a short document. Warren had asked his lawyers to keep it plain, and they had. The key provisions were 3. The first named Camille Rivers as general manager at a salary 5 times what Gerald had been paying her, effective immediately and retroactive to that morning. The second established a kitchen policy. Any customer who came through the door would be served whatever they could afford to pay, and the difference would be absorbed by the operating budget as a fixed expense, not deducted from staff wages, not noted in any record, not made into a transaction between the customer and the person serving them. The third provision established a small community fund administered by Camille at her discretion for specific needs of the neighborhood the diner had been serving for 19 years. Quietly and despite the owner, it turned out rather than because of him. When Camille read the document, she sat with it at the corner table for a long moment. Warren was across from her. He had ordered black coffee. She looked up at him. He said, "There are a few other things." He told her about the collections debt, cleared 3 weeks ago through a legal trust, anonymously as far as the collections agency was concerned, not anonymously as far as she was concerned because she deserved to know. He told her about Marcus's school situation. He had retained an education advocacy firm in Jacksonville the week after he had watched Marcus come home with a bruise and the principal's dismissal, and the situation had been reviewed and addressed, and the relevant parties had been very clearly informed of their obligations. He told her about the education trust, fully funded, covering Marcus's schooling through college and whatever came after, administered independently so that it had no connection to Warren and no strings that tied it to anything between the two of them. Camille listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady. She said, "You did all of this before you came back." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why before?" He said, "Because I needed you to know that it was not about what happened this morning. It was not about watching Gerald fire you and wanting to fix it." He paused. This was before this morning. This was because of who you are and what you did and what it did to me and what that obligated me to. Not to you, to the person I am trying to be now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The community fund. I want to run it the way I run the food, without making people feel like they are receiving something instead of just living." He said, "That is exactly why it is yours to run." In the weeks that followed, the diner opened under new management with no press release and no announcement. The change was visible in small ways. The sign was gone from the window. The extra biscuits kept arriving without explanation. The check stayed face down. The community around it noticed and responded in the way communities respond to places that have decided to be genuinely open, quietly, consistently, with a specific loyalty of people who have found somewhere that treats them like they belong. Big Ray stayed. He had been offered a substantial raise and a kitchen budget that gave him, for the first time in 4 years, the means to do what he actually knew how to do. He responded by producing food of a quality that attracted customers from well outside the neighborhood, which Camille had not anticipated and found quietly satisfying. Miss Dottie still arrived at 7:15. She still brought her own newspaper. She still saved Warren the sports section on the morning she finished it before he arrived, because Warren came back to Jacksonville 6 times in the following year, and every time he came he sat in the corner table and ordered black coffee and the day special. Earl taught him the full set of domino rules. Warren became competent over the course of 5 visits. Not exceptional. Earl was always better, but genuinely engaged, which Earl said was all that ever really mattered. Warren also did 3 other things in the 12 months following that Friday in Jacksonville. The first was that he restructured Holt Enterprises' hiring and investment practices, not as a press release or a foundation announcement or a public positioning exercise, but as a quiet internal overhaul that his board questioned and that he declined to explain beyond saying it was overdue and it was happening. It happened. The second was that he sat in a room with 2 people whose family members had worked for him and whom the organization had failed, not through his direct action, but in his name and on his watch. And he listened to what that failure had cost them, and he did not bring lawyers, and he did not bring a settlement offer, and he did not bring anything except himself and the truth and the specific accountability of someone who has stopped explaining and started being responsible. The third was that he called his federal contact shields and told him he wanted to make a statement, not for prosecution, not for any legal purpose, but for the public record, about the culture inside Holt Enterprises that had allowed Elena and David to operate the way they had for 2 years without internal challenge. He said it on the record in plain language that cost him professionally, and said it anyway, because the truth of it was more important than the cost. On a Tuesday morning in October, 12 months, almost to the day, from a Friday the SUVs had pulled into the parking lot, Warren sat at the corner table at Sunnyside Diner with a black coffee, and the sports section, and the particular quiet of a man who has no performance left to maintain and no version of himself to protect, and is simply, for the first time in a long time, present in the place where he actually is. Camille came by and topped up his coffee. He thanked her. She asked if he wanted the usual. He said yes. She went to put the order in. At the kitchen pass-through, she said, "Big Ray," corner table. "The usual." Big Ray said, "Got it." Through the diner window, the Jacksonville morning was doing what Jacksonville mornings do in October. Warm light coming off the water. The sky, the particular blue that belongs to coastal Florida and nowhere else. The road outside the diner moving with the quiet, ordinary traffic of a Tuesday in a small town that had not changed in its essentials and had changed completely in the thing that mattered. The door of Sunnyside Diner was propped open, not because of the policy, not because of a sign or a statement or a press release or any of the mechanisms by which institutions announce their values to the world, simply because it was a warm morning and the air coming off the water was good, and the door was open, and everyone who walked past it was welcome to come in. That was all. That was enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the simplest kindness can travel further than we will ever know and land exactly where it's supposed to. Subscribe to Echoed True Stories. Turn on that notification bell. And come back, because more stories like this one are already waiting for you.